So I want to welcome everybody to Fright Night Friday. We hope you enjoy tonight's creepy stories curated by our readers, who I'll introduce now. First, we have Renee. Say hi, Renee.
Hello.
And Bonnie. Yay. And of course, myself. And we have Brooke as well. Say hi, Brooke. And I'm also pleased to have Katie Otten joining us tonight. She will be playing the role of Mrs. White in a story I'll be reading about midway through. So I guess without further ado, we can turn the mic and the control over to Renee so she can start regaling us with her story for tonight.
All right. So for any of you who know me, it is no secret that I am obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe. So I'm going to be reading you tonight The Mask of the Red Death. If you've never heard it before, it is about a plague called the Red Death, and we're having kind of an interesting life imitating art right now moment. And this is by no means meant in poor taste. I kind of thought this would give us an opportunity to connect with this story on a level that we would never have had the opportunity to before. But because it's fiction and fantasy, we have the opportunity to view it with some sort of filter of distance. So if you feel like you'd be bothered hearing a story about a plague at the moment, you're welcome to rejoin us in about 20 minutes. The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence over 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A lofty and strong wall girded it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved neither to leave means of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provisioned all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many places, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here, the case was very different. As might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre, the apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor, which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to each other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been seen since in Ernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon, there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand. But the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than that which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock. And thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then, finally, of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited. But the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and had gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger, neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet, all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around, but the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next, his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person. And while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming, upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterwards, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment and, seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped, in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died, each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness, and decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
Nice.
That was amazing, Renee.
Thank you.
Very good job. Loved it.
Thanks. My favorite thing is I took a class in literature in college, and I did a paper about that story. And Poe was always very deliberate about his narrators. And so it makes you wonder, there's no one left alive at the end to tell the story except one character.
Red Death.
Ooh.
Oh, that's so creepy.
I know.
Very
That's
creepy.
my favorite.
It's so cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for reading that. That was great.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Excited to hear everybody else's.
Yes. Well, next up we have Bonnie, who's going to entertain us with a little bit of creepiness as well. All right, Bonnie, the stage is yours.
All right. So this is going to be a little bit more cash. I am sort of a curator of spooky stories, like a collector of spoopiness. I have enjoyed hearing people's supernatural accounts ever since I was very young. And so whenever anybody comes over to my house and it's like late at night, I can usually coax them into telling me about any sort of supernatural encounters that they had. So this is going to feel a little bit more casual. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are here in this room with me, or maybe like we're around a campfire, but we're super relaxed. So like grab your popcorn and something to drink, and we'll get to it. So the first story that I'm going to tell you is a personal account. I grew up in a house that was 100 years old. So there were, of course, drapes that moved on their own because of drafts, and doors would settle and open and close by themselves. Sometimes you would hear footsteps and things of that sort, all perfectly ignorable and easy to explain away. There is one instance, though, that was a little bit harder for me to explain away, and so I'm going to share that with you. So I was in high school, and I got home from school a little bit later in the afternoon that day. I parked my car in the garage, which was a separate building from the house. We lived on an acreage, so I walked across a driveway that was a big gravel space where machinery could turn around. And I walked up to the house and I pulled open the screen door to go into the covered porch. And right away, I could hear chattering in the kitchen. And this is like the space where my mom and my sister would decompress after a long day, right? So my sister would share all the gossip in the kitchen. Like she would just scooch right up to the counter. And so I went to grab the doorknob into the house. It's a big, heavy wooden door with a chunky metal doorknob. And when I grabbed the doorknob, I heard shh, 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 and then the chattering stopped. So immediately I know, okay, this is not the day's gossip. They're talking about me. And now they heard that I come home, so they stop the gossip. So I'm a little agitated. So I go to pull the door open, and the bolt is turned on the door. So it's locked. And if you've grown up on an acreage, you know that that is a rare occurrence. Like, we'll lock the door at night when everybody's sleeping, or we'll lock the door if we're on vacation. But otherwise, there's so much in and out. Like, nobody locks the door. I didn't even have a key with me. So I had to go out into the yard to go get the secret key. And now I'm very annoyed. So I come back in the house, I put the key in the bolt, and I turn the bolt. And I go into the house to like find out why everybody's picking on me today. And I go in and nobody's in the kitchen. And I'm thinking, now they're hiding from me. Like this, like, what have I done to deserve this kind of abuse? And so I go around from room to room calling out. And then I realize that nobody is in this house but me. And so I kind of get a little uncomfortable about my previous, obviously, auditory hallucination. And so I pick my backpack back up and I go back across the driveway to where I had parked my car in the garage, and the stall next to my car is empty and nobody's there. And so I get in my car and I drove over to the neighbors where I hung out until later when my folks were home. But yeah, my mom and my sister were out that day. Nobody was home. And it was a little spoopy and creepy.
That's very creepy.
Not a fan of that
I
because
liked
I've
it.
been in that house.
It's creepy, isn't it?
Nice.
Yeah, so I don't know who it was or what it was, but there was multiple of them, and they heard me come in the door. And then
They didn't want you to hear them.
Do you have
Oh.
any crawl spaces or like tiny doors anywhere?
There's a tiny door in the basement that goes into a crawl space, of course.
Ooh.
Did you ever
Ceiling in the hallway upstairs that goes into the attic? That terrified me my whole life.
Did you ever check the crawl space for bodies?
I mean, the Christmas tree was in there, and it kind of looked like a body.
Well, that counts, I guess.
Right in a bag. All right, so I'm going to tell you another story, and this didn't happen to me, but like I sort of like experienced it play by play because it happened to my best friend. And like our families were friends, and so they would come over for dinner so often, and we would get regular updates. So it felt like it happened to me, and I remember it pretty vividly. But the whole situation started with an account from my best friend's younger brother. And so he filled us in on what happened. So he wakes up in the middle of the night, and in his room is fairly lit because he is kind of a scaredy cat. Mm-hmm. He has to have all of his window drapes open. And so that way the farm light that's right outside of his window can stream in to his room. So it's like an epic nightlight situation. So he wakes up and his eyes are adjusting and he kind of looks around the room. And then he hears a noise from his closet. It's like kind of a settling, squeaking noise, right? And so being a scaredy cat, now he's like terrified, like traumatized. And then as he's watching the closet, like intently, the door to the closet starts to push open.
No.
And out from the door slides a adult-sized figure with dark hair, sort of like messy around their face, like bedhead, and light-colored flannel pajamas that have been washed so many times that the pattern is a little bit faded. And he's like heart-stopping scared until he realizes that this is his mom. And she maybe is sleepwalking, I don't know, but she just slinks out of his closet into the hallway and is gone. And he just is like, oh, that's a little strange, but you know, he goes back to sleep. And then the next morning he's like, you know, you were sleepwalking, you maybe need to like adjust your life so you're less stressed. And so then, you know, we're having dinner with them, and over lasagna, he shares this story about how his mom was sleepwalking in the most fantastically spooky way. A few weeks later, my friend reports another account she's sleeping in her room, and she's the opposite. She has all of her drapes closed with big heavy drapes because she can only sleep if it's pitch dark. And she also has like 100 plastic glow-in-the-dark stars glued to her ceiling. So it's very important that it's very dark in her room so she can appreciate her glow-in-the-dark stars. Now, her closet is actually connected to her brother's closet. It's a sort of funky attic situation. It's a bit shaped like a triangle. And he has one door, and it goes all the way down the length of the house. And then she has the other door. And in between, they sort of store like winter coats and plastic tubs full of holiday decorations. And then on his side of the closet are his clothes, and on her side of the closet are her clothes. And suddenly, in the middle of the night, she is woken up by a light in her face. And as her eyes adjust, she realizes that her door to her closet is wide open. And her brother's door to his closet is wide open. And, how that got left like that, she doesn't know. But the result is that farm light coming all the way down that corridor and slamming right into her face. And now she's awake. So she's thinking, maybe I'll get up and I will close the closet door, or maybe I'll just roll over. And then as her eyes are adjusting to the dark, she sees some movement in the closet. And she can see in the middle of the closet, there's sort of this soft movement back and forth. And as she focuses, she can see that it's someone's hair kind of swaying in the light. And she sees that there's a person perched on the edge of one of these plastic tubs, sitting with their hands on their knees and just a little swaying in the farm light, enough for their hair to move. And she's thinking, at first she's startled, and then she realizes, this is my mom, and she's sleepwalking again in the most heinously creepy way possible. So she decides that this is pretty spooky. And so instead of bothering her mother, she decides to just roll over and go back to sleep, pull the covers over your head and just forget that this ever happened. And so there was a few sleepwalking instances where her mom was just having sleepwalking's always a little bit unsettling, but just the most awful, disturbing sleepwalking episodes that were just making the family a little on edge. So then the whole family is set to go to the city and stay for the weekend at her mom's sister's condo. So it's a little crowded, but that's what they like to do. So they all pack up to go, except her dad is called in to work overtime that weekend, which I'm sure he's not that, upset about. So he decides he's going to stay home and the rest of the family is going to go. So he works his overtime. He's tired. He comes home. He reads a book. He has some microwave pizza rolls. And eventually he goes upstairs and goes to bed. And he's asleep. While he is asleep, he is woken by a creaking sound in the hallway. And he's, he's sort of woken up and he's thinking, oh no, I hope I can get back to sleep. I hope I'm not awake for the rest of the night. This is awful. And then his wife comes into the bedroom and she's got her pajamas on and her bed head is completely out of control. And she looks just completely groggy. And he's like, oh, is she sleepwalking again? And then he looks at her oh no, I think she went and got up and went to the bathroom. And that's what woke me up. So he didn't want to move because he didn't want her to feel bad for waking him up. So he just pretended that he was still asleep while she kind of shuffled in and she slides into bed next to him. And so he carefully rolls over so as not to give away that he's awake. And he looks at the back of her head. And then waves of realization start to kind of rush over him that his wife and kids are somewhere else for the weekend. This is not my wife in this bed. I am dreaming. This is wrong. And so he just lifts out of the bed and falls to the floor, scurries up the wall and turns the light switch on. And now he's like dripping sweat and like pounding in his chest and like breathing heavily. And he turns around like he doesn't want to look, but he looks in the bed and there is no one in the bed. Like no one at all. And so I would have left, but he's like, well, and he gets back into the bed and he like goes to sleep. And then he's like telling us this later, right? Because this is the conclusion of the saga of his sleepwalking wife. And my parents, like over homemade pizza, are like, that, like, do you know what a doppelganger is? Like, it's not a celebrity that looks like you. A doppelganger is an evil spirit that pretends to be you until the opportune time where they can get rid of you and replace you. And maybe this doppelganger was waiting for the right moment and they seized that opportunity. And because you called them out, like they're gone now, because like this woman has not had another sleeping episode, like it's a sleepwalking episode since then. So
That's very creepy.
So
Wow.
Oh,
Nice job.
Sleepwalking is creepy though.
I would never go back in the house.
I know that's actually like one of several instances that they've had in that like that house. The people that lived in that house before they lived in that house also said that it was a horrible, like it's got like, it's got
I
some,
will visit a haunted house, but I will not live in one.
Right.
yeah. Oh, we boarded in that house, like
My dad actually, one of his brothers sleepwalked a lot, and he would do like the most intricate things. Like one time he got his tools and like took apart the toilet like while he was sleeping and went back to bed. And they woke up in the morning and they're like, what happened? And he like did all that and had no idea.
It was his doppelganger.
Oh gosh.
like when my husband was in college, his roommate, like they would fix up old computer parts. There was big computer towers and huge tube computer monitors in their dorm room. And he had this reoccurring night terror that like, cause his roommate would sleepwalk too. And so he had this reoccurring night terror that his roommate would pick up one of the monitors and drop it on his head while he was sleeping.
It's so scary.
Yeah.
That would be horrible.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I'm a like kicker and puncher, but I haven't gotten very far with sleepwalking. So I have time for one more story.
Yeah, sure. Go.
Okay. So this one, I want to say this one was like passed down, but no, this happened in like the early 90s, I think. But it's a family story, so it's very special to me. So we do tell it at like family function. This is like this Thanksgiving spooky story. So a great aunt owned a large, beautiful farm. And on that beautiful farm was a beautiful, huge farmhouse. And I remember it very well. It had lots of really interesting features, but my favorite thing was when you walked into the front door, there was this big, beautiful wooden staircase. And the staircase opened up in sort of this hall situation. And the first room in the hall was like a foyer, and it was very fancy, like a parlor. And in the second room in that hallway was like a den. And from like both of those rooms opened up with these big French doors with lots of glass pane. So you could see the staircase from both of these rooms. And if you kept going down the hall, you would end up like in a kitchen. And the kitchen had a servant staircase, which was also really cool, but that does not apply to this story. So she eventually went into a retirement home and became elderly, and the property was like rented out and like taken care of by various people. And it was sort of like a question about what was going to happen with the property. And then when she finally passed away, it was given to a cousin of mine who was just getting into farming. And so he wanted to go and like live in the house, but the house had been empty for maybe like 6 or 7 years before he moved into it. And the property had sort of fallen into disrepair. So there was a lot of work to be done before he was comfortable moving his young family in. So he would spend a lot of time there, working in the farm and working in the house. And there was like most of the furniture was sort of cleaned out of it. But there was this old ratty sofa that was in the den, and then there was also like a TV in there and just like some random things, and that was sort of like his little hovel that he lived in if he stayed overnight there, since he was working there all the time. So there was one evening where he was working very late and decided that he would stay over, and he got this Afghan blanket, and he got cozied up on the ratty plaid itchy couch, and he was watching the little television with the rabbit ears for a while, and then he decided to go to sleep. So he turned that off, and he went to sleep, and then he was woken up in the middle of the night, which is a common theme with these spooky stories, to some thumping upstairs. And he's thinking to himself, like, oh no, like I've left something open somewhere. There are raccoons upstairs. This isn't good. And then pretty soon he hears a thump that was much heavier than a raccoon. And so he's thinking, oh no, I didn't lock up one of the doors. Somebody thinks that this place is still abandoned. They don't know I'm in here. Like, I don't want to meet this person. And so he thinks to himself, maybe it's safer if I just don't move, and maybe they'll leave and they won't know that I'm here. And that will be like, that I don't have to have an interaction with this person. So he's just laying on the couch with the blanket sort of up over his head. And then suddenly there's some door slamming and a thump. And he can clearly see down the big open wooden staircase is a big burly man. And he's got a plaid shirt on, and he's got some overalls on, and he's got a seed hat that's really ratty. And he just comes down the stairs, and he goes and he slams into the front door and is pulling on the front door. And it's not coming open for some reason. And then he can see the guy tears around like the hallway, and he stops and he looks right into the den. But he said he looks like through me, like he just didn't notice that I was there at all. And then he looks behind him, and there's this little triangle shaped closet under the stairs, and he rips the closet open and he throws himself inside. And then there was just a click of the lock on the closet closing. And so my cousin's like, this is my time to go. And so he gets up and he goes out the front door, which opened no problem for him. He gets into his truck and he drove straight into town, and he phones up like the local sheriff, and he's like, there's a man in my house. Like, obviously people don't know I'm, that like, I need help. Please come out and check this out for me. So they go out together and they follow him out there, and they go in the house and they flashlight her on, and they're like, they're gone. Like, this person is gone. They're not there anymore. And so he's like, well, like, he threw himself in the closet. So he goes inside with the sheriff, and the sheriff's like, this closet right here. And so they kind of pull on it, and it's locked. And he's like, oh no, that guy is still in there. So they go and they get some tools, and they take the door off the hinges, and they're ready for some sort of altercation. And there is no one in that closet. And that closet doesn't even lock from the inside. It just locks from the front with a skeleton key. So like, yeah. And so when in the tradition of telling this story at family gatherings, that's when my dad always chimes in, and he goes, I'm not scared of that guy if he's a ghost. I'm scared of what's chasing him.
I like it. Nice.
Oh my gosh. I feel
That's
like the
very
moral
creepy.
of these is not to go to sleep. I don't know.
That's a really
Right.
good point.
Yeah.
I think the moral of the story is we shouldn't be doing all this social distancing because it leaves us alone and susceptible to ghosts.
Oh no.
Big burly crawl spaceman.
Yeah.
Yes. Right.
Really
Very
panic.
good.
Wow.
Very nice group of stories. Thank you very much. That was awesome.
Hey.
Yay. Okay, well, next, Katie and I will be doing a story out of the monster book of supernatural stories. And it's kind of weird because every time I open the book, there's a different story in the beginning. I don't know how that works. But anyway, tonight's story we'll be doing is called The Monkey's Paw. And this was first published in England in 1902, and it was written by a gentleman by the name of W. Jacobs. So there's a section in here that sort of betrays its when it was written, but I'll point that out at the end of the story. So, okay, are you ready, Katie?
Ready.
Let's see. Should I go big screen on us? I think I will, and then the screen might jump back and forth when Katie reads her part, but I think people will be okay with that. So, all right. So, let's see. I'm seeing Katie right now and not me.
You won't see yourself in speaker mode or whatever.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so, but they will. They should.
All right. Okay. So, The Monkey's Paw, Part 1. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go back to gallery view. Let's do it this way. All right. The Monkey's Paw, Part 1. Outside, the night was cold and wet. But in the small living room, the curtains were closed and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were playing chess. The father, whose ideas about the game involved some very unusual moves, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary danger that it even brought comment from the white-haired old lady knitting quietly by the fire. "Listen to the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a mistake that could cost him the game after it was too late, was trying to stop his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the son, seriously studying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'll come tonight," said his father, with his hand held in the air over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," cried Mr. White, with sudden and unexpected violence. "Of all the awful out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Can't walk on the footpath without getting stuck in the mud, and the road's a river. I don't know what the people are thinking about. I suppose they don't think it matters because only 2 houses in the road have people in them."
"Never mind, dear,"
said his wife calmly.
"Perhaps you'll win the next one."
Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to see a knowing look between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty smile in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged shut loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose quickly, and opening the door, was heard telling the new arrival how sorry he was for his recent loss. The new arrival talked about his sadness, so that Mrs. White said,
"Oh, tut, tut,"
and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, heavily built, strong-looking man, whose skin had the healthy reddish color associated with outdoor life, and whose eyes showed that he could be a dangerous enemy. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him to his wife and his son Herbert. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the offered seat by the fire, watched with satisfaction as Mr. White got out some whiskey and glasses. After the 3rd glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk. The little family circle listened with growing interest to this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and brave acts, of wars and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, looking at his wife and son. "When he went away, he was a thin young man. Now look at him."
"Oh, he doesn't look to have taken much harm,"
said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and the street entertainers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the old soldier quickly. At least nothing worth hearing.
Monkey's paw?
Said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major, without first stopping to think. His three listeners leaned forward excitedly, deep in thought. The visitor put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. Mr. White filled it for him again. To look at it, said the sergeant major, feeling about in his pocket, it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and held it out for them. Mrs. White drew back with a look of disgust, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Asked Mr. White as he took it from his son, and, having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major. A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who tried to change it would be very sorry. He put a spell on it so that 3 different men could each have 3 wishes from it. The way he told the story showed that he truly believed it, and his listeners became aware that their light laughter was out of place and had hurt him a little. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert cleverly. The soldier looked at him the way that the middle-aged usually looked at disrespectful youth. I have, he said quietly, and his face whitened.
And did you really have 3 wishes granted?
Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth.
And has anybody else wished?
Continued the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His voice was so serious that the group fell quiet. If you've had your 3 wishes, there's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused me enough trouble already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's just a story, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, watching him carefully, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw, and holding it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. Mr. White, with a slight cry, quickly bent down and took it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier sadly, but in a way that let them know he believed it to be true. Well, if you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend with stubborn determination. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't hold me responsible for what happens. Throw it on the fire like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his possession closely. How do you do it? He asked. Hold it up in your right hand and state your wish out loud so that you can be heard, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of what might happen.
Sounds like the Arabian Nights,
said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the dinner.
Don't think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me.
Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and all three laughed loudly as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "If you must wish," he demanded, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of dinner, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the three sat fascinated as they listened to more of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time to catch the last train, "we shan't make much out of it."
Did you give anything for it, Father?
asked Mrs. White, watching her husband closely. "A little," he said, coloring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." "Not likely," said Herbert, with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy." Smiling, he said, "Wish to be a king, Father, to begin with. Then Mother can't complain all the time." He ran quickly around the table, chased by the laughing Mrs. White, armed with a piece of cloth. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it doubtfully. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I've got all I want." "If only you paid off the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. "Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'd just do it." His father, smiling, and with an embarrassed look for his foolishness in believing the soldier's story, held up the talisman. Herbert, with a serious face, spoiled only by a quick smile to his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few grand chords. "I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man clearly. A fine crash from the piano greeted his words, broken by a frightened cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved," he cried, with a look of horror at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table. "And I bet I never shall."
"Well, it must have been your imagination, Father,"
said his wife, regarding him worriedly. He shook his head. "Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again, while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man jumped nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. An unusual and depressing silence settled on all three, which lasted until the old couple got up to go to bed. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, as he wished them good night, "and something horrible sitting on top of your wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten money." Herbert, who normally had a playful nature and didn't like to take things too seriously, sat alone in the darkness, looking into the dying fire. He saw faces in it, the last, so horrible and so monkey-like that he stared at it in amazement. It became so clear that, with a nervous laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing some water to throw over it. His hand found the monkey's paw, and with a little shake of his body, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. Part 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. The room felt as it always had, and there was an air of health and happiness which was not there the previous night. The dirty, dried up little paw was thrown on the cabinet with a carelessness which indicated no great belief in what it could do.
I suppose all soldiers are the same,
said Mrs. White.
The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted these days? And if they could, how could 200 pounds hurt you, father?
Might drop on his head from the sky, said Herbert. Morris said the things happened so naturally, said his father, that you might, if you so wished, not see the relationship. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Herbert, as he rose to go from the table to work. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, greedy old man, and we shall have to tell everyone that we don't know you. His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him go down the road. And returning to the breakfast table, she felt very happy at the expense of her husband's readiness to believe such stories. All of which did not prevent her from hurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor, when she found that the post had brought only a bill talking about how sergeant majors can develop bad drinking habits after they leave the army.
Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home,
she said as they sat at dinner. I know, said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to.
You thought it did,
said the old lady, trying to calm him. I say it did, replied the father. There was no thought about it. I had just... What's the matter? His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, looking in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of shiny newness. 3 times he stopped briefly at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it and then, with a sudden firmness of mind, pushed it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her hurriedly, untied the strings of her apron, and put it under the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed a little uncomfortable, into the room. He looked at her in a way that said there was something about his purpose that he wanted to keep secret, and he seemed to be thinking of something else, as the old lady said she was sorry for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, which he usually wore in the garden. Then she waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to state his business. But he was, at first, strangely silent. I was asked to call, he said at last, and bent down and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. I come from Ma and Megan's. The old lady jumped suddenly as in alarm.
Is something the matter?
She asked breathlessly.
Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?
Her husband spoke before he could answer. There, mother, he said hurriedly. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir. And eyed the other, expecting that it was bad news, but hoping he was wrong. I'm sorry, began the visitor.
Is he hurt?
Demanded the mother wildly. The visitor lowered and raised his head once in agreement. Badly hurt, he said quietly, but he is not in any pain.
Oh, thank God,
said the old woman, pressing her hands together tightly.
Thank God for that.
She broke off as the tragic meaning of the part about him not being in pain came to her. The man had turned his head slightly so as not to look directly at her. but she saw the awful truth in his face. She caught her breath, and turning to her husband, who did not yet understand the man's meaning, laid her shaking hand on his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White, too shocked to think clearly. "Yes." He sat staring out the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, he pressed it as he used to do when he was trying to win her love in the time before they were married, nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wishes me to pass on their great sadness about your loss," he said, without looking around. "I ask you to please understand that I am only their servant and simply doing what they told me to do." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath unheard. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant major might have carried into his first battle. "I was to say that Ma and Megan's accept no responsibility," continued the other. "But although they don't believe they have a legal requirement to make a payment to you for your loss, in view of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, stared with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. "How much?" £200 was the answer. Without hearing his wife scream, the old man smiled weakly, put out his hands like a blind man, and fell, a senseless mass, to the floor. Part 3. In the huge new cemetery some 2 miles away, the old people buried their dead and came back to the house, which was now full of shadows and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of waiting for something else to happen. Something else which was to lighten this load too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and they realized that they had to accept the situation, the hopeless acceptance of the old. Sometimes they hardly said a word to each other, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to tiredness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and he could hear the sound of his wife crying quietly at the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold."
"It is colder for my son,"
said the old woman, who began crying. The sounds of crying died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He slept lightly at first, and then was fully asleep until a sudden wild cry from his wife broke him with a start.
"The paw!"
she cried wildly.
"The monkey's paw!"
He started up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She almost fell as she came hurriedly across the room toward him.
"I want it,"
she said quietly.
"You've not destroyed it?"
"It's in the living room on the shelf above the fireplace," he replied. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over kissed his cheek.
"I only just thought of it,"
she said.
"Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?"
"Think of what?" he questioned.
The other 2 wishes,
she replied quickly.
We've only had 1.
Was that not enough? He demanded angrily.
No,
She cried excitedly.
we'll have 1 more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again.
The man sat up in bed and threw the blankets from his shaking legs. Good God, you are mad, he cried, struck with horror.
Get it.
She said, breathing quickly.
Get it quickly and wish, oh, my boy, my boy.
Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. Get back to bed, he said, his voice shaking. You don't know what you're saying.
We had the first wish granted,
said the old woman desperately.
Why not the second?
Coincidence, said the old man.
Go and get it and wish,
cried his wife, shaking with excitement. The old man turned and looked at her, and his voice shook. He has been dead 10 days. And besides, I would not tell you before, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?
Bring him back,
cried the old woman, and pulled him towards the door.
Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?
He went down into the darkness and felt his way to the living room and then to the fireplace. The talisman was in its place on the shelf. And then a horrible fear came over him that the unspoken wish itself might bring the broken body of his son before him, before he could escape from the room. He caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His forehead cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and along the walls until he found himself at the bottom of the stairs with the evil thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and, to his fears, seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her.
Wish,
she cried in a strong voice. It is foolish and wicked, he said weakly.
Wish,
repeated his wife. He raised his hand. I wish my son alive again. The talisman fell to the floor, and he looked at it fearfully. Then he sank into a chair, and the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and opened the curtains. He sat until he could no longer bear the cold, looking up from time to time at the figure of his wife staring through the window. The candle, which had almost burned to the bottom, was throwing moving shadows around the room. When the candle finally went out, the old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, went slowly back to his bed, and a minute afterward, the old woman came silently and lay without movement beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. They heard nothing else other than the normal night sounds. The darkness was depressing, and after lying for some time building up his courage, the husband took the box of matches and, lighting one, went downstairs for another candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he stopped to light another. At the same moment, a knock sounded on the front door. It was so quiet that it could only be heard downstairs, as if the one knocking wanted to keep their coming a secret. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, not even breathing, until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and ran quickly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house.
What's that?
Cried the old woman, sitting up quickly. A rat, said the old man shakily. A rat. It passed me on the stairs. His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock echoed through the house.
Oh, it's Herbert!
She screamed.
It's Herbert!
She ran to the door, but her husband was there before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he asked in a low, scared voice.
It's my boy! It's Herbert!
She cried, struggling automatically.
I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door.
"For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, shaking with fear.
You're afraid of your own son!
She cried, struggling.
Let me go! I'm coming, Herbert! I'm coming!
There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden pull, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the top of the stairs and called after her as she hurried down. He heard the chain pulled back and the bottom lock open. Then the old woman's voice, desperate and breathing heavily.
The top lock!
She cried loudly.
Come down! I can't reach it!
But her husband was on his hands and knees, feeling around wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. The knocks came very quickly now, echoing through the house, and he heard the noise of his wife moving a chair and putting it down against the door. He heard the movement of the lock as she began to open it, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw, and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking stopped suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair pulled back and the door opened. A cold wind blew up the staircase, and a long, loud cry of disappointment and pain from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side and then to the gate. The streetlight opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. The end. There. What'd you think?
I've been scared of that story ever since before I ever heard that story, because my mom told me about it when I was little, and she said it would be too scary for me. And so it was a long time before I ever actually heard it myself. But
Oh, wow.
just the idea of this decomposed corpse of their mangled son standing
Yes.
in the doorway. Ugh.
How it got itself out of the grave, I don't know, but that would have been quite a challenge. But it's
Long.
supernatural. It can do anything, I guess. The part I was talking about, that kind of dated it was where the one part where she was held her patience as long as her sex would permit her. When I read that the first time through, I thought, oh boy, that's an old one. Yeah. But it was a good story.
Bill. That was exciting.
Yeah. Thank you, Katie. You were great. Thank you very much.
Great
Made the
job.
story really good. Yeah.
Yay.
It was just coincidental that Katie offered to do a role, and I happened to find this story that just had a single female role in it. And I thought, seems like it's meant to be. So
Yeah.
that's what I decided to go with. So anyway, thank you, Katie. It was great.
That was
Okay.
great. I've never heard that one before.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. All right. So next up is Brooke. And Brooke, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay. I am reading a story. It's a creepypasta, which comes from the internet. So therefore, I will be reading it on my phone.
Okay.
I was going to try to prop a book, but this is just easier. And it's an internet story. So the thing about creepypasta is that it's usually written in such a way where it very well could be a personal account of a true story. This is written more in a narrative fashion. I felt like that would be more appropriate for this particular setting. But it's called Bound, and it's from a user called Bunlala. Here we go. Paul pulled the envelope out of his leather attaché case and settled into an uncomfortable chair behind a large writing desk. Late afternoon sun filtered in through the bay window, but couldn't defeat the darkness of the old house, nor the dreariness of his mood. Luckily, he had the mind to pack a few battery-powered lanterns, and one of them now provided enough illumination to examine his mother's ornate handwriting on the back of the envelope. For Paul, it read. He traced the letters with his fingers. each one written with care and love. Pensively, he squeezed the bridge of his nose and released an exhausted breath. He had admittedly taken the loss of his mother very hard, as she was a kind, bright, thoughtful woman, taken way before her time. But he was a lucky man, and had married a woman who exuded those same qualities and had been blessed with a daughter whose genes seemingly came from the women in his family. He had received the envelope several weeks before at the allocation of Mother's will. Its content undoubtedly was a letter, most likely full of sage advice and love. He had agonized over opening it, though, as he was unable to come to terms with reading his mother's final words. But his wife, Lauren, had finally convinced him that they might provide comfort rather than sadness. With final resolve, he retrieved a dusty letter opener from the desk and began to read the handwritten letter. Let's open it up. Let's see what we have. To my dearest Paul, there are not enough words in the dictionary to express my love for you, Lauren, and your sweet baby Emily. I only hope that I have shown you that love over your 25 years of life. My health may be fading, but know that I will always be with you, and that I'm sorry for what I'm about to reveal to you. I fear, though, that there isn't enough forgiveness on God's green earth for what I've done. If you are reading this, that means that my final will and testament have been executed, and you are probably surprised to find that you are now the owner of a small farmhouse in Creekside, Pennsylvania. It is the house that I grew up in. Heed my words, Paul. Do not go to that house. Put the deed in the back of your safe. Claim it as an asset, but otherwise forget that it exists. You may be curious to see the childhood home of your mother, but please do not go to that house. I'm going to tell you why, Paul, and you may not have the same respect for me afterwards, but it is imperative that you understand the gravity of the situation. My parents and I had moved from that house when I was around 15 to live with Aunt June. However, when I was a few years younger than you are now, fresh out of college, I was offered a teaching position at a school a few towns over from that childhood home. You know, my parents both passed away shortly after we had moved to California, and now I'm telling you that they too had left me that house in their will. But they never provided me with the knowledge I'm about to bestow upon you. My poor, sweet Paul. Out of convenience, I moved into the house several weeks before summer ended. The town hadn't changed much. It was still secluded, surrounded by forest, and its residents were still fairly strange and private. They did remember who I was, though, and they definitely remembered the accident that caused my family to leave. As I was buying some groceries, the woman behind the counter recognized me and told me that I shouldn't have come back, and strongly suggested that I should turn around and leave right then and there. She grabbed me by the hand forcefully to express her urgency. There was a scar on her arm, just like the one I bear. The one I told you I got from falling off of my bike as a little girl. I was admittedly a little freaked out, but not enough to take her advice. That whole town is a little kooky, and at the time I thought I was being shunned for what happened when I was a teenager. But there was a fearfulness in her tone that has sat with me all these years. The house had remained untouched for 8 years, and I spent that first day cleaning a thin film of dust off of everything. I was exhausted by nightfall, and feeling that it was awkward to sleep in my parents' old bedroom, I opted for my old one on the first floor. Because my room was small, my bed was flush against the wall, partially covering the only window in its length. A dresser and vanity were against the parallel wall. I remember collapsing into that bed that night, my body aching from moving boxes and cleaning. I'm not sure what initially woke me up that night, Paul. I don't recall a noise that pulled me from slumber, but I was overwhelmed by a feeling that I was not alone. Moonlight through the window cast shadows, but after a quick scan, I knew that room was devoid of life, save for me. And then I saw it, in the vanity mirror, a reflection of the window, and looking in through the window was a creature that should not exist, that cannot be from this world, too horrible for words. Just know, Paul, that this, even in the pale light, you could see the vile intentions in its inky eyes and snarling, fanged mouth. It looked excited and hungry. Its gray hands pressed against the glass, each elongated alien finger leaving a filmy residue behind as it dragged its claw-like nails down the window. My back was turned to it, my feet only a few inches away from its face, separated by a thin pane of glass. I watched it feverishly watch me through the mirror. Unable to tell if it was aware that I knew it was there, I nonetheless felt like it was waiting for me to move. I, however, was frozen with fear. Honestly, if something by the grace of God hadn't stirred me from my sleep, the sound of its screeching nails would have woken me. I was able to quell a surprised reaction and remain still. Maybe it was minutes, maybe it was hours, but the thing finally left. I'd be lying to you if I told you that was the first time I ever saw it, though. I'm so sorry, Paul. There are 3 creeks that run parallel in the woods that surround the town, a few miles apart from one another. Of all the rules given to us children of Creekside, the most important one was that we were not allowed to pass the second creek, and we were strongly urged not to venture too far past the first one. My parents told me there were old foundations and wells that made it dangerous for us kids to play there, and that several children had gone missing in the woods. But it was apparent that the adults of town never crossed the second creek either. A few people who had risked getting close to the second creek claimed they had seen ghosts among the trees. And that lore alone was enough to convince us kids to stay close to town. My best friends growing up were Jimmy and Andy. Jimmy, you know, would later become your father. But Andy was always a bit of a daredevil and troublemaker, and I was an impressionable young girl. One day, Andy had stolen a few of his dad's cigarettes, and the 3 of us went into the woods like a bunch of sis to smoke them. Andy got the crazy idea that we needed to rebel even more and explore the woods past the second creek. Jimmy and I were scared, for it had been so ingrained in us to never do it, but Andy was persuasive. Andy crossed the ancient-looking bridge over the second creek first, cigarette in mouth. Jimmy and I delayed across from him. It became clear that Jimmy wasn't going to do it. He threw a rock at Andy, calling him an idiot, and started walking up the path towards town. I begged Andy to come back with us, and I must have thrown my head back in frustration when he teased me. That's when I saw it. The gray, gargoyle-like creature. It was perched in a tree, not too far away from where Andy was standing. It looked like a vulture eyeing its prey. I had barely started to scream when it leapt from the tree and tackled Andy to the ground, back to my side, but neither of us had any idea what to do, let alone how to comprehend the fear. I could hear Andy screaming and fighting, and I swear, Paul, that sound has never left my ears. I grabbed a rock and ran across the bridge. I hit the thing over the head, but it swiftly knocked me back into the water. I struggled, but Jimmy pulled me out on the other side, just in time to see the creature make off with Andy's limp body through the trees. I don't know how long Jimmy and I sat there in shock, but the stars were out when we reached my house. We told our worried parents and the other adults who had gathered there our story. All of them seemed more shocked that Andy and I had crossed the creek than by descriptions of the creature. Jimmy's mom let out a cry of relief when she realized her boy had not crossed. But my parents started packing up loose belongings and clothing hastily. We left town that night and drove the whole way to Aunt June's, only stopping once outside of Chicago. My parents died only 6 months later from a disease that doctors couldn't identify. I was young and didn't understand. Everything was a blur, and I couldn't discern one emotion and memory from another. At some point, I started believing that Andy had fallen in the creek and hit his head on a rock, and that my parents' passing was an awful coincidence. It was easier to cope that way. And then I saw that hideous face in the window, like it had claimed me nearly a decade before and had been waiting for me ever since. I was relieved when it left, but fearful, for I did not know where it had gone. I remained frozen. Early the next morning, a knock came from the front door. I hesitated, gripped again by fear, but it was Jimmy. A nostalgic reunion was halted by his urgency to discuss something with me. I knew what it was before he even sat at the kitchen table. I wasn't prepared for what he was about to tell me, though, Paul. I'll spare you the details and tell you only what you need to know. This thing that lives in the woods has been there for a really long time, Jimmy says, far before the original settlement of Creekside. Nobody knows exactly where it came from or much else about it, only that it was responsible for the vicious deaths of many of the town's children. It likes young blood, Jimmy told me. Nobody could figure out a way to kill it either. But the thing was conniving and sentient, and realized that if the people left, On the other hand, the townspeople feared that wherever they went, the creature would follow. So a deal had been made in blood. Anything that moved between the oval, the second and third created belonged to the creature, and in turn, the creature would never harm anything that didn't cross that boundary. Jimmy told me I belonged to the creature because I had crossed the bridge, and my parents had been killed because they betrayed the pact. You see, Paul, it's a curse. I know it's hard to believe. Didn't take me long to make the decision to leave Creekside again. Jimmy didn't know definitively what geographically bound the creature, but had done enough research to estimate that it only traveled within the confines of Creekside and nearby townships. He had also discovered around the world. These things are all over the place, and sorry, Paul, this is not important now. Check the files within your father's study. They'll tell you more than you need to know. Don't delve too deep, though. It was his obsession that cost him his life, not the car accident I lied to you about. I'm so sorry. Jimmy helped me throw a few boxes into my car and promised to meet me again soon. I turned around one last time to share a moment of silent solitude with him before I got in my car. As I turned back, I could see terror transform his face. He called my name, but I didn't have appropriate time to react. The creature bounded from the woods and leapt to the roof of my car. It crouched, dropping its face to be even with mine. Sneering, its rancid breath smelled of dried blood. Buckled as Jimmy swooped in to tackle the thing off of the roof. Jimmy fought with all his might, but wasn't a match and ended up crumpled a few feet away from me. In hysterics, I tried to flee, but quickly found I had nowhere to run. The thing caught me promptly and dragged me into the woods with little effort. Jimmy composed himself enough to start running after us, screaming for me to make a deal. I lost consciousness before I could make sense of what Jimmy was telling me, a fleeting memory of Andy whispering in my mind. Paul, please remember how much I love you as you struggle to manage the final parts of my story. A small fire blinded me as I awoke on cold, damp ground, surrounded by trinkets of times gone by. An old wind-up children's toy, a few dog collars, Andy's engraved lighter, bones were littered. The creature sat squat across from me, watching me zealously. It was muttering anxiously and rocking on its wolfish feet. I was surprised, as ancient as Jimmy told me this thing was, to find that it spoke English. Spoiled, it said gravelly. You spoiled. I remember its coal eyes following me as I nervously brought myself to a sitting position. I knew it was you. Too old now. Spoiled. I seemed to be in a cavern of some sort with two tunnels that faded to blackness, neither discernible as the exit. I haven't forgotten its words, nor the look in its eyes when it stopped rocking. You can't leave. You are mine. You belong to me. You crossed the water. But you are too old to eat. Realizing the thing was contemplating over whether to kill me, or I understand that he had meant for me to make a deal with the creature for my life. The creature liked to bargain, so I asked it, Paul, what it wanted in exchange for letting me go. It thought a while before it smiled maliciously. It wanted one of my children and one of my children's children. I wondered if this thing had been around long enough to inspire. I don't know, Paul, but I took that deal. I had children. I would bring one of them to the creature, and if I had grandchildren, I would sacrifice one of them as well. Might seem like a rough bargain, but it would get two for letting one go. You might be sickened now, Paul, but realize that after considering the offer thoughtfully, I simply intended to just never have children. I resolved to give up becoming a mother. I thought I had tricked it. The creature took my hand, cutting its claw deep into my forearm, creating a brand that would bond me for life. Then it simply, he had gathered, waited at the bridge. None of them asked me how I survived. They all knew by the scarlet letter on my arm. As you know, Jimmy would leave Creekside and settle with me near Aunt June in California. In good conscience, I couldn't sell the house and put another family in the vicinity of that evil thing. I had become resigned to the fact that I had to abandon the opportunity of motherhood, but could never bring myself to permanently and medically destroy the chance of pregnancy. I couldn't do it, Paul. And Jimmy and I were careful even after we married, but several years later, I became pregnant with you and your twin brother, Andrew. I know that's a shock. I'm not proud of what I did, Paul, and I regret never telling, though, that the creature would take me as it did my parents if I betrayed our deal. The scar on my arm burned long before I took that baby, Paul, that infant, only a few days old. I took him back to Creekside and left him on the other side of the bridge, on the second creek. I am unworthy of forgiveness, and to this day, the memory induces nausea and an unbearable heartbreak. It was an evil thing for me to do, but it let me watch you grow up into the man you are. I have given you every ounce of good news. I can't pay them this time. I can't do that to you or sweet Emily. I have lived my life and only hope that I can be reunited with your father and Andrew on the other side. I fear that my actions have provided far more insidious consequences, however. I will repeat my initial warning, Paul. Do not go to that house in Creekside. Only evil awaits there. I can't bear to imagine if the creature is able to reach Emily, our sweet, sweet Emily. I love you, Paul, with all my heart. I am so sorry. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Paul put the letter down on the writing desk. He could distinguish disturbed and disgusted emotions amongst a primal fear and sadness. He couldn't categorize and understand his thoughts. He was unable to tell if these emotions were targeted towards his mother or himself. His mother had made some awful and anguishing decision, sure, but he probably should have read the letter before he brought his wife and daughter to this place. Suddenly, his mother's childhood house seemed a little darker. Dazed, he tried desperately to grasp the connotations of his mother's letter. The sound of glass smashing broke his stupor. The sounds of glass shattering, the ferocity of his wife's screams, and the fading wail of his daughter's cries. The end.
Wow. Great job, Brooke.
I couldn't figure out why, like, what in the world does she have to be sorry about in the beginning?
Oh,
Get it. Oh, dear.
wow.
And
I
then-
love how very,
Well, it doesn't matter. They don't have to go to the house.
yeah, I know. I love how different all these stories were. They're all like different genres almost.
Yeah.
Wow.
I wonder if Bonnie has any more accounts from her friends. We've got a little bit more time.
I've got one. I've got one queued up. If y'all are interested. Nobody goes to sleep in this one. So.
Oh, wow.
Oh, good.
What do you think?
All right, let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
I still have some more water.
Okay, this one I picked up when I was in high school at a slumber party. So my friends and I went over to a friend's older sister's house. So her family was like super conservative. So slumber parties at her house were like a little awkward, like bedtime was really early. But we were fortunate enough that our parents let us go to her older sister's new apartment in town. And we got to watch like Nightmare on Elm Street. We got to order takeout. Like it was like amazing. And so then after a bunch of prodding, like my friend convinced her sister to tell us the following account. So she was married very, very young, and she wasn't very financially stable after marriage. And she was living with her parents, and her new husband was living with his parents. And they kind of just stayed in that situation after they were married because they didn't feel comfortable moving into either parent's house as a couple. Like it was just too tense and uncomfortable. So they continued like living separately. And so then a house became available in the area. It was like a very distant relative had been renting it, and he had just evicted some renters and had like a whole strew of really terrible renters in this house. And he was like, okay, there is some damage in this house. If you help me fix it up, then I will charge you like almost nothing for rent in exchange. And so they were so excited to be able to get a place together that they moved out there like that day, like even before it was maybe practical to be living there. So like it was like there was clearly like a leak in the roof. So that was the very first thing that they tackled that day. Was her husband got on the roof and like figured out where the leak was coming from. And while he was on the roof, she was in the living room looking at the extent of the water damage in the corner. And it was clear where the water was coming in because the wallpaper in the corner of the room was like sagging off the wall. So she just kind of grabbed the bubble and like poked a hole in it and peeled it back just to see what was back there. And it was like old plaster, but it looked like it was maybe an okay condition. But she was like, that's like a big job. So I'm not going to tackle that today. So she just sort of left this chunk of wallpaper in the corner of the room, peeled halfway off the wall, like several layers of really thick 60s wallpaper. And she got to cleaning in the kitchen and scrubbing, like it was really filthy. So then finally he is finished on the roof and they come inside. And there's like they had moved in a sofa and a TV, and they were like, you know what? We're gonna have a stay over tonight in this house. Like, we're just gonna hang out in here, like, so that we can finally have a house together, whatever. So they like plug the TV in, and they're watching TV, and like they, you know, bake a pizza in the oven or whatever. Maybe they got a pizza from Casey's. I don't know. So they're eating their pizza and watching TV and loving the fact that they're in like this disgusting broken down house that's finally like one that they can be in together. And then she said that suddenly she felt really like nauseous. And then this sort of oppressive feeling came over her that someone was watching her. And she said like she put her pizza back down on her paper towel and looked over at her husband, who was already looking at her. And they sort of shared this telepathic message of, you know, I feel like someone is watching me. There's something not quite right. And they break away from each other's gaze and they turn around. And for some reason, their eyes are drawn to that corner of the wall where the wallpaper had been pulled down. And she said that there was an eye there in the wall and it was looking at them. We had just watched Nightmare on Elm Street and we were like, excuse me? And I was like, you mean there was a hole in the wall and someone was in like watching you? And she was like, no, the eye was the wall. Like it was in the wall, like the house was watching us. And so they got like in their car and they drove away from that place. And I can tell you for a fact that they did not rent to that place, that the guy that owned it actually used a backhoe and dug a hole next to that house and pushed that house into the hole and then pushed dirt over top of it. And when you drive past it now, you can kind of tell where it is because there are there's a windbreak of trees next to it. And there are some like new houses sort of popping up around it. And I wonder, like, maybe don't build like right on that spot.
I hate it.
Oh, I really want to know if the new houses are like haunted now.
Well, I like there wasn't really a reason. Like there's no like nobody died in that house or anything. I don't know.
That we know.
He did say he had some nasty renters.
Yeah.
Maybe they were like summoning demons or something.
No.
House
Maybe they
demons.
killed someone and hid him in that wall behind that wallpaper.
Wow.
We'll never know. It's
Yokai.
buried in the earth now. It's where it's not gonna
That's crazy that they just buried the whole house. Wow.
Some kid's just gonna be digging in there, and then he's just gonna find an eyeball.
Oh,
It'll be like Jumanji. Don't dig it up. Yeah.
no.
Good story. Good
Oh.
stories.
Yeah, good job, everyone.
It's so fun.
Mhm.
Will, you're muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, it was very cool. Thank all you guys for coming on board and helping do this Fright Night deal. It was great.
Thank you for
Love-
setting it up.
Yeah, loved all the stories and everything. Kind of a nice way to spend a Friday night in quarantine.
Yeah.
What were you saying, Renee?
Oh, yes. Thank you for having us, Bill. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We're really glad you came and joined us.
Yep. Thanks to the listeners out there. And if you liked what we did and you'd like to see another one, add some comments to the video, and we'll check them out, and maybe we'll do another one of these down the road. So cool. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the live stream. So
Bye.
there's a way to stop it.